think we have a bit of time for questions, and I will navigate in the room to give you the microphone. This. So, is there any question in the audience?
You can ask in French as well.
Vous pouvez les poser en français, hein, et puis on essaie de traduire.
Je vais faire en français parce que mon anglais est très mauvais, mais si j'ai bien compris, l'objectif du projet, c'est d'arriver à trouver des stratégies qui amènent le mieux possible à des partages de pouvoir, ou en tous les cas, de trouver la meilleure façon à la fois d'y amener et de construire ce partage de pouvoir. Du coup, la question que je me pose, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut arriver à avoir finalement quelque part une solution clé en main qui soit générale, alors qu'on l'a vu à travers vos exemples, à chaque fois, c'est des cas qui sont extrêmement diversifiés, avec des conflits soit d'origine purement ethnique ou purement religieuse, ou les deux, et pour le cas de la Nouvelle-Calédonie, avec des modèles de société en plus qui sont vraiment très très opposés pour ceux qui doivent arriver à se parler ensemble. Merci.
Alison, you got that? So
I got a little bit of it, yeah.
Okay. So the question is basically you're trying to see how power is sharing across different islands, different areas, regions, and how will you be certain that we will find, you know, like made solution for each of them, considering all the particularities of each territories?
So I would say the first thing is, thank you. Thank you for the question, merci. I'll turn it up to you. So I think first is there won't be one single solution, either across our cases or in each case over time, right? And that and that particularly in those situations where it's sort of, you know, where the choice seems to be either a yes or no, those are pretty hard perspectives to bridge. And so I think one is looking for those sort of zones of possible agreement that might exist in between sort of very entrenched positions, and that those might be really small to begin with. But starting to find where there might be those moments of opportunity, and that will look different across our cases as well. That there's going to be no sort of single solution at all. So I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, precisely. But even if there is a possible outcome that we might not identify any common patterns, but we still find solutions for each of the countries, right? And each of the regions, each of the case studies, which is very important because talking about important parts of the world, large countries like regions that maybe now, this is still very important. But there is a possibility also that we identify some not necessarily common variables, but generalizable mechanisms that might be relevant to a lot of cases. So if we do this type of intervention, if we provide more security or more economic compensations or apologies, then more likely to see higher levels of support for power sharing. And in each of these mechanisms, the variables might be different, but the logic, the causal logic, might be transferable from one case to the other. If we identify something like this, potentially, then we would be in a better position in the future to advise new power sharing arrangements as well.
In the case of Mindanao, there are big Mindanao Island and then Apachagos and smaller islands. And one of the key messages that those who are negotiating at the peace, negotiating at the table, emphasize inclusiveness. So although we are, say, big group, but we never leave the smaller group behind. During the negotiation, that was the kind of a message, and also international community who are monitoring the process tries to encourage this inclusiveness. Having said that, once they have reached an agreement, then it becomes more of the power struggle, who gets what, who is to dominate, and then most marginalized populations are kind of left out. So it's very important to probably institutionalize the rights of minority in the peace agreement, and somebody needs to, say, keep monitoring. Otherwise, this kind of minorities' views are eliminated, ignored, and that is a challenge. And I think the lesson we can learn from the past cases. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. It's all very, very interesting. There's one thing that's been bothering me for the whole time of the presentation. It's been just covered slightly for your last presentation. What do you make of the time factor? You know, the whole evolution with different generations who, you know, by the time there's a conflict and there's a problem, and then it sort of like diffuses in the generation. There's the whole conception of this reality through people's memory, and then by the time it's been sort of studied, and then you try to come to a settlement, but then things have changed already because generations have been passing by. I mean, talking about, you know, something that happened in 74, it's quite a while away for young people, I don't know, like turning 20 now. If I take for example, New Caledonia, when we have what we call the events in the 80s, I wasn't born. I was born for the time of peace, and so that's something that I take very differently. Although I know that there's the whole problem of that settlement that we all live in. And so, in your study, what do you make of the time factor? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because the way time is being imagined by people in different countries, it's very different. So what is 1974 might sound to all of you here as something that happened a long time ago, but to a Cypriot, that's yesterday. You know, that's a perception of time that is very different depending on when you went to school, where you went to school, what you have learned all your life. So this is something that. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, there are new realities on the ground, and these realities are reflected in legal decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, the rights of people who came to Cyprus after 1974. That the Greek Cypriots called settlers, the Turkish Cypriots called migrants. All these are the new realities that one should take into consideration. The changing demographics in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the question, the answer though, is that we have some evidence that shows. In most cases, and not just Cyprus, that every time you go to the negotiating table, the set of available options do not change that much. It's like every time you go back, and there is a very similar set of choices on the table. Think of the Lebanese case, right? you have the terrible civil war, and guess what? They ended up having the same, more or less the same arrangement proposed to them. So this is the irony when you study power sharing, that you return back to it quite a lot throughout the life cycle of negotiations.
And it's one of the things that we're going, like, that is really important for us to look at too, is that generational effect, and is there convergence between people who lived through the conflict, who lived through the negotiations and all the sort of difficult compromises that had to be made, and those who grew up during the time of peace, and where those perspectives might vary or come together, right? And so one of the things I think, which is why we think of it as a life cycle, is that need to recommit to sharing power. And it's different for different generations as to why that might be a necessary component, or whether it is still for newer generations. And so that is one of the things that we will be looking at over the course of the project as well, is that sort of different generational understandings of the agreement and what might be necessary to move forward. So in some of my research in Lebanon, I've had conversations with people who, because things are really bad in Lebanon right now with the financial crisis and just sort of, total state immobilism right now. Many people saying, well, this is the worst it's ever been. And then people who are like, well, I also lived through the Civil War, and having that debate between different generations as to like where, like what is holding things up now. And for many young people in Lebanon, seeing power sharing as the thing that is failing them, because political actors can't agree with each other. So some generations saying, well, we needed to make this compromise in order to stop the war, and others seeing it as the thing that is holding them back. And so trying to sort of understand those different perspectives will be really important.
Maybe we need to do further studies, but this is my own personal impression. The first generation of the rebel leaders are more charismatic and ideological, and they are not willing to compromise. When they passed away or become too old, the second generation leaders can emerge, and they are more practical and technocratic, and some of them have a good education. So I think the way of dealing with power sharing, or the approach towards power sharing has shifted a little bit. Interestingly, in the old days, Moro Islamic Liberation Front are considered to be terrorists. They are called terrorists and target for law enforcement. But now, after the peace agreement, they are on the side of the government, and these former terrorists are now trying to catch the current terrorists. And then I saw that the former, same Muslims fighting with each other. So probably in the national level, they are no longer fighting with the Filipino armed forces, but the conflict continues. But this time it's more to do with your neighbors, your competing clan and competing tribes. And with that, I think the memory of peace and war has not changed much. Also from outside, they have made a peace agreement, so the Mindanao become peace. But from the local point of view, it has not changed much, and they are still operating in the mentality of something like a war. And probably the youth is another group that can be marginalized most of the time. Those who have holding power is usually senior citizens with a gray hair like me. So younger generations felt that their voices are not well represented. So we are seeing, after the peace agreement, there's a gap between the senior leadership and the younger leadership. And one of the younger leadership, who is also charismatic, in a way, actually created a separate group. And then the other younger group, young generation who are more energetic, passionate about their own identities, struggle, they joined these radical groups. So that's, I don't know how I can summarize, but there are youth who are more likely to become radical, and you also need to include them. Otherwise, you keep producing a radical element, and then the vicious cycle of violence continues. Thank you very much.
Is there any more questions?
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a linguist here at the University of New-Caledonia, so as you may guess, I will have a question about languages. And so I was wondering, do you think, or in your different contexts or experience, that languages can be or are a clue, a key also about this power sharing? How much plurilingualism or language sharing can help or participate to power sharing? Thank you.
Yeah, that's I think fundamental. That when it comes to power sharing, it's not just political institutions. The power sharing. Power sharing is also a mindset that includes a lot of changes in the way that we're dealing in everyday life. Bilingualism, Canada is an example where French and English and the First Nation languages are now included. Paradoxically, Cyprus didn't solve the problem, but Turkish is still used in passports and official documents. That could be also a potential solution to the Ukrainian crisis, having official bilingualism, making a concession to the Russian minority but not Russian. That could be part of a peace plan, part of a way of bringing sides together. But this is also in Northern Ireland, obviously, in terms of celebrating Gaelic. Could be it was something that was already in the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. So bilingualism is something, or multilingualism is something that is essential when we're talking about peace processes. It's part of the arrangement, if you wish, the overall arrangement, and it comes. It's normally associated with power sharing. There's some cost to it. Getting these type of peace agreements is both costly and time-consuming. And if I could go back to the previous question, young people tend to be asking for quick solutions sometimes. We are a generation, or you are a generation that cannot wait for for long processes. You can't wait for a year to form a government, right? But this is often the side effect of reaching compromises, and it has to be taken as part of life.
I would like to introduce the case of Timor-Leste, which could be more relevant to the case of New Caledonia. The East Timor used to be the colony of the Portugal. When the Portugals, there was a coup in the homeland, and the government decided, okay, we are going to release all the colonies. And there was a civil war in Timor-Leste. Those who wanted to remain the tie with Portugal, and those who wanted to be immediate independence, and those who wanted to rejoin with the neighbor Indonesia, because they are ethnically the same. But the Dutch colonized Indonesia and Portugal colonized Timor-Leste, and they just made a line between the two. So there was a civil war. And then, long story short, they did a referendum, and they voted for independence much later in 1999. And with the intervention of the United Nations, they are becoming an independent country. The question was, is going to be the official language. Those who were elite and educated under Portuguese, they escaped when the Indonesian came in. They escaped to Portugal or Angola or Mozambique, and they were educated, elite. And when they came back, they wanted to make Portuguese as their national language. But the younger generations, who, because they had been under the occupation of Indonesia for 24 years, Indonesia introduced the Indonesian language as a national language. So younger generation of the elite are educated in Bahasa Indonesia, and they are educated in university in Indonesia. But they are considered to be some of the collaborator with the occupier. When they become independent, there's a debate. We don't want to make Indonesian as our national language, although majority of people speaks. But this is your enemy's language, so you don't want to stop it because you are going to become independent. But again, the elite are insisting, okay, we should introduce the Portuguese. But only 1% of the population, the top of the top, speaks Portuguese. And there is no Portuguese elementary school teachers, junior high school teachers, no, nothing. There's no history books written in Portuguese of their stories. So there was a huge debate. And somebody talking about, why don't you introduce English? But English is then you become like a colony, de facto colony of Australia, for example. So they decided to put Portuguese as a national language. And all the public servants have to speak Portuguese. The national university professors need to speak Portuguese. They have to teach in Portuguese. Public servants need to speak Portuguese, and nobody speaks Portuguese. And that's very much problematic. But then they have been independent for the past 20 years. So the younger generation are learning Portuguese. So there's a divide. My generation never learned Portuguese, so more comfortable in speaking in Indonesia. But they cannot get a government position because they don't speak Portuguese. So their first generation of the levels are still in the parliament, in the government, and the younger generation is quite frustrated. So it's a very difficult choice. If the New Caledonia decides to become independent, do you continue to use French as a national language, or you want to have some kind of a Kanak language? Timor-Leste, there's so many different tribes, and each tribe speaks different languages, and there's no so-called national languages. You don't want to use the language of the colonial masters, but you don't have your common language, and that was a major challenge, and also undermined a lot of the development project, because they said Portuguese, but nobody is speaking, but everything has to be written in Portuguese, and that's a major impediment for the development. I'm sorry, my talk becoming too long, but that is a very key issues. Language related to your identity, and also very much related to your further development in the near future.
Other questions? We have to.
Hello. I would be very interested in the role of external institutions in setting up power sharing, and then also in negotiations further on. How would you judge the influence in the process to come to a solution in the future? Thank you.
What do you mean by external institutions?
You were just in your case, you had on your sheet that the diplomats were failing in Cyprus. So I don't know, Northern Ireland, you could argue about the European Union, the role of the European Union, Ireland, how how does that, yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of the external institutions, in the Cypriot case, it was under the United Nations. The United Nations were the mediators. The EU offered an incentive to bring the two sides of Cyprus together. However, the EU could not sit on the negotiating table after Cyprus joins the European Union, because the Turkish Cypriots will not accept it as an impartial side, because now two countries, Cyprus and Greece, are influencing the decisions of the international organization. It is also the case that international organizations can have a positive effect by providing some sort of economic packages. Very important in the case of Northern Ireland, in terms of the support from the European Union. It is, though, a question of whether they themselves could sit on the negotiating table when one side thinks that it's a very good idea to have them on board. Currently, the Greek Cypriots are supporting EU taking a bigger role in the negotiations, but the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey say, hold on, you can't do that. And both sides need to be on board. What further complicated the case of Cyprus is that the EU-Turkish relationships have gone sour. Up until 2004, there was still imaginable that Turkey might improve its relationship and join the EU at some point. That's not the case anymore. So that big carrot of Turkey's entry to the EU is not available yet. Is not available anymore in the negotiations. So the EU could not provide the credible incentives to any of the two sides, and it's even difficult to be part of the negotiation process at this stage. The UN as well does not have the power to impose any solutions. Increasingly, the Security Council is much more divided. So one could imagine in the 1970s Gaddafi resolving a problem, right? In the 1980s and 1990s, the UN playing an important role in places around the world. But currently, in the past decades even, with the division within the Security Council, they can appoint a representative in a place like Cyprus, someone who could go there and put the sides together on the dinner table. But do they have an influence? Can they credibly threaten or incentivize a peace process? Very little there.
And maybe just to add to that too, I think there are some scholars who would argue that power sharing is very difficult to reach between actors in a conflict, often requiring some kind of external mediation to help facilitate an agreement. Part of the challenge of having that external support during the adoption phase is what happens later on. In many cases, again, when you reach deadlock or those moments of immobilism, external actors sometimes come back to help break that deadlock. And that sort of both can be positive, but also negative in that if you know someone else is going to come make the difficult decision for you, then you're not incentivized to cooperate with local partners. So this is part of the story of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is that 30 years on from the end of the war, or nearly 30 years, you have still an office of the High Representative, this international diplomat who has the power to overturn domestic legislation or to sort of make decisions when local actors don't agree. And so that has often meant that the parties know that they can wait out in their own perspectives and not have to compromise with each other, because eventually the High Representative will get fed up and make a decision. So external support can sometimes be really good and sometimes be really bad. And so that is a very sort of contextual, there's a sort of contextual answer to your question in terms of that external support. Same thing in Northern Ireland. I mean, whether you see Ireland and Britain as external actors depends perhaps on how you see the conflict as well. But that's been, you know, why you've had these series of sort of add-on agreements after the Good Friday Agreement has been because the parties sort of don't agree with each other, and then there's somebody there to call everyone together to get an agreement around the table. So again, it can work sort of both ways, that external involvement.
On external involvement in Mindanao is a quite interesting case. In the Cyprus, the UN or the West, when they mediate, they're likely to propose a peace agreement draft. This is the way you do it. In the case of Mindanao, Malaysia played a mediator's role. And also Japan and Norway also joined. I was sent as the Japanese representative in one of the peace negotiations. And I asked my government, is there any policy that I need to observe? And our government said, no, just respect the wishes of stakeholders there. And all we need is a peace. And what kind of peace, we don't care. So that was a kind of a policy. So in that sense, diplomats never fail, because it is them, the parties, who decide what to agree on. And we have no kind of hidden agenda. That was the kind of a major thing, that a different involvement of the outsider. Having said that, the Moro Islamic Front are the minorities, and you know that after 9/11, the Islamic group kind of marginalized in the international arena. So they did their best to keep Western interest in the peace process. Because once peace agreements are signed and the international community lost their interest, Filipino government can do whatever they want. So very interestingly, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the most Islamic fundamentalists, always keep saying human rights, gender mainstreaming, minority rights, so that appease the West. We are on the same page. And that also, I think, find it very interesting. They like the Asian mediator who doesn't say much about the content of the peace, but they don't trust the Asians because we don't have a enforcement kind of power. It's Americans who actually have the final say. So we want to keep the Americans, but we don't want Americans to say in the contents of the peace agreement. And that was, I think, the role I found, an interesting role of the external in the Mindanao peace process.
If I can add a very short point in response to Eugene, there are elements of power sharing once you reach a settlement that might require external involvement. That involves peacekeepers, foreign judges, and other foreign institutions that might be in your territory. And it's very interesting from a citizen perspective to see whether these outside elements are supported by the public, and to see also the trends across time. So our experience from Cyprus from 2004 is that there was a very strong opposition to those external institutions. But the surveys we see right now show that this is not the case. Increasingly, a lot of support for external involvement and institutions that might be supporting a future settlement. So following up some of these trends is very important, because they can help us align what is the interest at the global level, what are the public preferences on the grassroots level.